It's been years since I last saw that house, but sometimes it feels like it's still watching me, waiting for me to return. I guess I should start at the beginning. I had been looking for a place to live after things fell apart with my roommate. I wanted something quiet, a place where I could have space to think and breathe. That's when I stumbled upon the listing for a large, two-story house on the edge of town. It was old but too cheap, if I'm honest. But I didn't care. I needed to get away, and the price made it seem perfect. The landlord, Mr. Gale, was strange from the moment I met him. When I first saw him, he was standing on the front porch, wearing that long, old-fashioned coat that seemed out of place in the mild weather. His thin lips stretched into a smile that never reached his eyes. "You must be the new tenant," he said, his voice smooth but unsettling, like someone trying too hard to sound normal. I shook his hand, feeling the coldness of his skin, and forced a smile. "Yeah, I'm here to see the house." He didn't say much as he led me inside, just glanced at me from time to time with that same smile, watching. The house itself was, well, it had potential. It was huge, with high ceilings and lots of windows, though most of them were covered in dust and grime. The floors creaked with every step, and the air smelled stale, like no one had lived there for years. Still, it was livable, or at least I convinced myself it was. The first few days were fine, or at least I kept telling myself that. The house was quiet, and it gave me the solitude I craved. But at night, things began to change. The footsteps started on the third night, just as I was drifting off to sleep. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but no, there it was again, a steady, rhythmic pacing above me. I was too tired to care, so I put a pillow over my head and tried to block it out. The next morning, I told Mr. Gale about the noises. He was standing in the yard, pruning a dead tree with an old pair of shears that looked far too rusty to still work. He didn't look surprised when I mentioned it, just nodded slowly, as if he had heard this complaint 1,000 times before. "Old house," he said, that smile curling back onto his face. "It likes to make itself known." I didn't know what that meant, and I didn't care to ask. The days started to blur together. Every night, the footsteps returned, louder and closer, as if whatever was walking was making its way toward me, step by step. But the real terror began when I heard the voice. I woke up in the dead of night to a soft, whispering sound. At first, I thought it was the wind blowing through the cracks in the old windows, but then I realized it was coming from right next to my bed. My skin prickled with cold fear as I strained to hear. "Leave" the word was drawn out, like a breath, a warning. I shot up in bed, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was dark, the air thick with the smell of damp wood. I flicked on the lamp, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the room was empty. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I looked around, but there was no one, just me. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next day, I confronted Mr. Gale again. I demanded to know if the house was haunted, if there was something he wasn't telling me. He just stared at me with those hollow eyes, unblinking, his smile gone this time. "The house doesn't like to be disturbed," he said quietly. "It has its moods." "Moods," I snapped. What the hell does that even mean? He didn't answer, just turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, my skin crawling. That night, the footsteps didn't come from above. They started in the hallway, right outside my door. I lay there, frozen, as they moved closer, slow and deliberate. The doorknob rattled, then twisted. I held my breath as the door creaked open, inch by inch, revealing the dark hallway beyond. I couldn't see anything, but I felt that something was there, just beyond the threshold, watching me. I slammed the door shut and shoved a chair under the handle. My heart was racing, every nerve in my body screaming at me to get out, to run. But I didn't. I was too afraid to even leave my room. The next morning, I packed my bags. I didn't care that I had only been there for a few weeks. I had to get out. I threw my things into my car and drove to the nearest motel, vowing never to return. But the house didn't let me go that easily. The phone calls started the next day. At first, they were silent, just the faint sound of breathing on the other end. I blocked the number, thinking it was a prank, but the calls kept coming from different numbers, always the same thing. And then, one night, the voice spoke again. "Come back." I threw the phone across the room, my heart pounding. I didn't sleep that night, or the night after that. The calls didn't stop, but I refused to answer. I thought that maybe, if I ignored them, it would go away. But I was wrong. One evening, I came back to the motel to find the door to my room slightly ajar. My stomach dropped. I pushed it open slowly, my hands shaking, and stepped inside. Everything looked normal, at first glance. But then I saw a trail of muddy footprints, leading from the door to the center of the room. The prints weren't mine. I backed out of the room, my skin crawling, and drove for hours, too afraid to stop. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get away, as far away as possible. For a while, things seemed to settle down. The calls stopped, and I moved into a new apartment. But every so often, late at night, I would hear it again, the slow, deliberate footsteps, the sound of breathing, always close, always there, as if the house had followed me. I tried to forget about it, but it's always with me. In my dreams, I see that old house standing silent and cold on the edge of town, waiting for me. And sometimes when I'm alone, I hear it, the voice whispering, calling me back. I know that one day I'll have to return. The house won't let me go forever. And I don't know what will happen when I finally do. I'd been living in the city for a while, hopping from one rental to another, when I stumbled upon an ad that seemed too good to be true. Spacious one-bedroom apartment, quiet neighborhood, affordable rent. At the bottom, a hastily scrawled note looking for a responsible tenant. Call Mr. Ashford. The price was much lower than anything else I had seen. I figured there must be a catch, but curiosity got the better of me, and I called. The voice that answered was gruff, deep, and a little too loud for my liking. "Hello. Yes, I'm calling about the apartment for rent," I said. "Ah, yes, the place on Briarwood," the man responded. "When can you come and see it?" "I could stop by this afternoon, if that works," I replied. There was a brief silence, and then, "That'll do. I'll be waiting." Something about his tone made my skin crawl, but the rent was too good to pass up. I packed up my things, grabbed a coffee, and headed over to Briarwood. The street was quiet, lined with tall, dark trees that cast long shadows in the afternoon light. The house stood at the end of the lane, tucked away like a secret. It was old, with cracked windows and a paint job that hadn't been touched in decades. Mr. Ashford was standing on the porch when I arrived. He was tall, much taller than I had expected. His thin frame was draped in a threadbare sweater, and his face was gaunt, as if he hadn't eaten in days. But it was his eyes that unsettled me the most. They were dark and hollow, as if something far worse than hunger had hollowed him out. "Come inside," he said, his voice low and gravelly now. I hesitated but followed him in. The inside of the house was just as run down as the exterior, dust-covered furniture, faded wallpaper, the faint smell of something sour lingering in the air. But the apartment itself was surprisingly clean, with fresh paint on the walls and hardwood floors that seemed almost new. "It's quiet here. You'll like it," Mr. Ashford said, turning to me with that strange, too wide smile. I tried to ignore the uneasiness settling in my stomach and nodded. It was cheap, and I needed a place fast. I signed the lease right there, and Mr. Ashford handed me the keys with a strange glint in his eyes. The first few nights were uneventful. The apartment was cold, much colder than I'd anticipated, but nothing a few extra blankets couldn't fix. I settled in, unpacked my things, and started to make the place feel like home. But on the third night, things started to change. I was lying in bed half asleep when I heard a faint tapping. It was soft at first, barely noticeable, but it grew louder and more insistent as the minutes passed. I sat up, straining to listen, trying to figure out where it was coming from. Tap, tap, tap. It seemed to be coming from the walls. I got out of bed and pressed my ear to the cold plaster. The tapping stopped immediately, leaving the room in an unsettling silence. I told myself it was probably just the pipes, or maybe an old house settling. Nothing to worry about. But the next night, it happened again. This time, the tapping came from the ceiling. I lay there, staring up at the darkened corners of the room, my heart racing as the sound grew louder and more erratic. Tap, tap, tap. I tried to ignore it, but sleep wouldn't come. It felt as though someone or something was inside the walls, scratching to get out. The following day, I asked Mr. Ashford about it. He shrugged, his bony shoulders barely moving under his tattered sweater. "The house is old," he said. "It makes noises. You'll get used to it." I wasn't convinced, but I didn't push it. Maybe I was overthinking things. Maybe I just needed time to adjust. But then the footsteps started. It was around midnight when I heard them for the first time, slow, deliberate footsteps, heavy on the floorboards above me. I froze, clutching the edge of my blanket, listening as the sound moved from one end of the ceiling to the other. I lived on the top floor. There was no one above me. I grabbed my phone and dialed Mr. Ashford's number, my hands trembling as the phone rang. After what felt like an eternity, he picked up. Yes, his voice was flat, devoid of any emotion. "There's someone in the house. I can hear footsteps. Above me." There was a long pause. Then, in a voice that sent chills down my spine, he whispered, "It's just a house, like I said. It has its ways." Before I could respond, he hung up. The footsteps became a nightly occurrence. Sometimes they'd start right after I got into bed. Other times they'd wake me up in the middle of the night, the sound echoing in the empty apartment like a sinister rhythm. I tried to sleep through it, but my nerves were fraying, and every morning I woke up more exhausted than the last. One evening, as I sat in the living room, the lights began to flicker. I thought it was just a power surge, but then I noticed something. The flickering wasn't random. The lights blinked on and off in a pattern, 3 short bursts, then a pause, then 3 more. It was as though someone or something was trying to communicate with me. I watched in horrified fascination as the pattern repeated over and over. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I jumped, nearly dropping it in my lap. It was a text from Mr. Ashford. "It's just the house. Don't worry about it." How did he know? I didn't respond. I couldn't. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, and the flickering lights cast shadows that danced across the room like dark figures looming in the corners. The final straw came about a week later. I was in bed, trying to block out the now familiar sounds of tapping and footsteps, when I heard a voice. Faint at first, barely more than a whisper, but it grew louder with every passing second. "Help me." Me. The voice was coming from the walls. I shot up, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The voice repeated, more desperate now. "Help me. Please." I bolted out of bed, grabbed my phone, and ran into the hallway, dialing Mr. Ashford's number with shaking hands. He picked up on the second ring, his voice calm and collected. "What is it now?" he asked. There's someone in the walls," I shouted, my voice cracking. There was a long silence, and then, in a voice so cold it made my blood run ice, he said, "There used to be." I didn't wait for an explanation. I ran out of the apartment, down the creaky staircase, and out into the cold night air. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stood on the sidewalk, staring up at the house. For the first time, I noticed something I hadn't before: black smudges on the window frames, like handprints. I never went back to that apartment. I left everything behind and never spoke to Mr. Ashford again. But sometimes, late at night, I can still hear it. Tap, tap, tap. It was my first night in the apartment when I first heard him. A slow, heavy creak echoed through the paper-thin walls. I paused mid-step, listening. Maybe it was the old wood, or maybe it was something else. This building, after all, had a life of its own. The landlord, Mr. Fletcher, had warned me about the creaks and groans of the ancient structure when I moved in that morning. "The house has been standing longer than I've been alive," he said with a raspy chuckle. "You'll get used to it. Just don't mind the noises at night." At the time, I brushed it off as a friendly warning, the kind older landlords gave to spook new tenants. But tonight, the creaking seemed to have an unnatural rhythm, as if someone was pacing back and forth just outside my door. I stared at the thin wooden door, the brass knob trembling slightly under the dim light of the hallway. I told myself it was nothing, but the uneasy feeling in my gut said otherwise. I locked the door and slid the chain across, feeling a sense of relief. Maybe it was my exhaustion playing tricks on me. It had been a long day of unpacking and settling in. The tiredness that weighed on me earlier now felt like an oppressive force, as if the very walls were pressing in on me. But sleep didn't come. Hours passed. The creaks outside my door continued, growing more deliberate. Every now and then, I thought I heard soft breathing, close but just out of sight. And then, silence. Complete, suffocating silence. No footsteps, no creaks. Just the kind of stillness that wraps around you like a cold fog, smothering every sound, every thought. That's when I heard it. A soft knock. It wasn't like a normal knock, but a hesitant tap, as if the person on the other side wasn't sure they wanted me to hear it. I froze. My heart thudded loudly in my chest, filling the quiet room with its frantic beats. I didn't want to get up. I didn't want to look. But something inside me, a sick curiosity or some primal instinct, urged me to approach the door. I stood a few feet from it, my hand hovering near the knob. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. No answer. Only the silence, so thick I could hear my pulse in my ears. Then came the sound of metal scraping. A soft, deliberate sound of metal sliding along the door's surface. Like a knife. My throat tightened. I backed away, my eyes wide with panic. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers trembling as I tried to dial the police. But then, a voice whispered from the other side of the door. "It's me. Fletcher." I felt a wave of dread crash over me. My landlord? Why was he at my door in the middle of the night? "What do you want?" I stammered, my voice barely holding steady. I could hear the smile in his response. "Just wanted to check on you. See how you're settling." In his voice was low, almost affectionate, but something about it felt wrong. Off. "I'm fine. Please, just leave," I said, gripping my phone tightly. My eyes darted around the room, looking for something, anything to defend myself with. "Fine, fine," he said, his voice growing distant. "I'll leave you alone. For now." I waited until I heard his footsteps retreating down the hallway. Then, I unlocked my phone and typed out a message to a friend, explaining what had just happened. But before I could hit send, my screen went black. Dead battery. I cursed under my breath and rushed to plug it in, my hands still trembling. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the door, listening for any sign of movement. but the night remained eerily quiet. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the door, but eventually exhaustion caught up with me. I lay down, my body tense and ready to react at the slightest noise. I woke up to the sound of soft footsteps just outside my window. My heart jumped to my throat as I sat up in bed, my breath catching in my chest. I could see the shadow of a figure moving just outside. Slowly, deliberately. Fletcher. I reached for my phone, but it was still dead. My only option was to stay quiet and hope he didn't try anything. The window was locked. He couldn't get in. Could he? Suddenly, there was a sharp knock on the glass, and I froze. He was standing right there, his face illuminated by the moonlight. He looked sick, his skin pale, his eyes sunken and bloodshot. But what terrified me most was the knife he held in his hand, the blade glinting in the pale light. "Let me in," he whispered, tapping the glass with the tip of the knife. "I just want to talk." My heart raced as I backed away, my body shaking with fear. "Leave me alone," I shouted, my voice cracking. But he didn't leave. He kept tapping the glass with the knife, his smile widening. "Let me in," he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. I scrambled to my feet and ran to the front door, fumbling with the locks. As I threw the door open and rushed into the hallway, I could hear him laughing behind me, a cold, hollow sound that echoed through the empty building. I didn't stop running until I was outside, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't return to that apartment. Not that night, and not ever again.